Hello, this is Sarah Tahir, the Associate Director of Professional Learning, and I am honored to be joined by Kevin Mattingly. Kevin, could you just take a few seconds to introduce yourself?
Sure, Sarah. I'm Kevin Mattingly. I'm a teacher, a coach. I've been that for about 35 years. I've taught all the way from elementary, but mostly middle school and high school students. In addition to being mostly a science teacher, a little bit of math teacher, I've also worked for about 25 years at Columbia University Teachers College with the Klingenstein Center there. And I currently teach some of their graduate courses in their master's program about how children learn.
Great. And so, Kevin, you're joining us today to sort of help launch our Rethinking Assessment pop-up course. And one of the first questions that I have for you is, how do you define assessment?
Well, that's a complicated question. Assessment in general is when we judge or evaluate something. And certainly in the context of teaching and learning, it's student work. But it's also assessing how well I teach. And so, there are different types of assessment. I'm sure our audience knows mostly about them, but I'll just say a few things. One is there's formative assessment, and that's assessment that is for feedback for students to learn and get better at something, but it's also feedback for teachers to get better at what they do. So formative feedback has two functions: student improvement and teacher improvement. And then there's summative assessment, which is what we're most used to doing, which is evaluating the quality of what kids do, providing some evaluative feedback on what it is, providing a grade or whatever it might be. And mostly in schools, and certainly in my career, I focus mostly on summative feedback in terms of evaluating student work in that way. One of the terms that, one way to look at this that years ago I got my brain kind of turned around on in good ways. I was fortunate enough to work with Grant Wiggins over the years. And he wrote in 1998 a book called Educative Assessment. And educative assessment, the way he looked at it, was assessment that was fundamentally about improving student learning and all that meant. And I'm sure, Sarah, we're going to talk more about that in the next few minutes.
Yeah, and I think with that sort of in mind, what are some of the misconceptions that exist around assessment and assessment practices?
A lot of them I have still and have had. Well, one of them is that assessment is mostly about grading, is about giving students some sort of summative feedback. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need to let kids know, and other people, other constituents in schools, parents and other teachers and whatnot, and the students themselves, the quality of what they're doing. And so that's important. But unfortunately, often that sort of feedback or that sort of assessment doesn't move learning forward. And so that's one misconception is that it's mainly for grading or for evaluative purposes. And one of the things I like to think, and again, people like Wiggins and Rich Stiggins and others have made me think a little differently about, is that rather than saying things like formative assessment or summative assessment, talk about formative feedback. Take the whole idea of assessment out of it. Certainly assessment is part of feedback, but we learn from feedback. And most importantly, we learn from feedback that we do something with. Dylan Williams, who's written a wonderful book called Embedded Formative Feedback or Formative Assessment, says this. I mean, he's being a little bit polemical, but he says this. He says the only important thing about feedback is what students do with it. And for me, that was the revelation when I first heard that many years ago, meaning I used to give kids and still give kids lots of feedback. But I realized that most of it or a lot of it wasn't as productive as it could have been or at all, because I didn't carve time in their time to do something with my feedback. And so again, one of the misconceptions is that feedback is, you give it and then that's it. But you give it, you provide it, hopefully clearly and in a way that students can understand. But at the same time then, in my practice and their practice, I carve time for them to look at that feedback, assimilate it, but then figure out a way to move learning forward. And again, that's the phrase that Williams used. He says, one way to look at feedback or any sort of information we give back to kids is we want to let them know where they stand with respect to where they are. So descriptive feedback that says, here's where you are, but also at the same time, and a priori, it shouldn't be after the fact, know where they're supposed to go. That is having clear, whatever you want to call it, models or examples or rubrics or standards or criteria, so they can see what's called the gap. And what we want to do is close the gap with them. And if we do that, if we give them feedback that's both descriptive, here's what your work looks like, and also prescriptive, meaning, okay, here are ways you can close the gap. Here are some strategies you can use. Here are some ways you can improve. As long as they can see that where the gap is and that they have ways to close it, that can be motivational, because one of the things with assessment, especially summative assessment or grades, is it can be really discouraging to kids. Even a B+ for some kids can be discouraging. And so if you focus more on, where are you, where do you want to go, and here's the gap, and let's figure out how to close it, and they can see over time that they're closing the gap, that's very motivating to a kid. And it's one reason why the research is really clear, and I think in my own practice, I've understood that, become to understand this, that you don't give grades with feedback. You, in fact, decouple grades from feedback. And what I'm saying is not that you don't give grades or you don't give some evaluative feedback, but I think we all know that the first thing a kid will do if you hand back a paper or you hand back a test is they're going to look at the grade. And depending upon what that grade is, like I said, for some kids, a B+ could be absolutely demotivating. It could be devastating because they're used to getting A's. And so that may affect then the way they process your feedback. On the other hand, a B+ for some kids could be, yes, I got a B+. That's much better than I thought I'd get. Game over. I'm not even going to look at the feedback because that's much better than I thought I would get. So when you decouple the grades or some evaluative feedback from what you're trying to get them to pay attention to, then that can really help move learning forward. The other thing, another misconception or misunderstanding, I guess a better way to say it, is that assessment involves only this unidirectional flow of information from student to teacher. And again, a lot of teachers have latched onto this a long time ago, but it's becoming more and more prevalent that having kids both self-assess and having kids also peer assess can be a really good way for assessment to happen. Now, both of those take a lot of work. A child's just not going to accurately and faithfully and reliably self-assess, nor is a peer going to be able to peer assess well. And again, in the research literature and just in the educational literature, there's lots of tips and ways to go about helping kids self-assess and peer assess. So those are a couple misunderstandings, all of which I have had and probably still do have to one degree or another.
Great. No, that I think is really helpful. And I love what you're saying about this concept of formative feedback, because speaking from an educator perspective, one of the most discouraging things as a teacher is when you've spent all this time crafting the feedback and finding ways to help your students with a summative assessment, and then you see that feedback ends up in the trash or that no one has read that. And I think for a teacher, from a teacher's perspective as well, that load, that stress that comes with providing feedback, and that anxiety over assessing student work definitely increases. But I like that idea definitely of formative feedback, and really seeing that it sort of in the in-between as well.
Right, and again, I have no stake in this, but Dylan Williams' book on embedded formative assessment and other work of Black and William and others, Rich Stiggins, talk a lot about you can, in fact, studies on this, where you can reduce significantly the amount of feedback that you give. And they've had whole school systems do this, where they actually reduce the feedback. But, and to follow on your comments, Sarah, they're sure that it's the most important feedback for an individual learner. And then they carve time in the child's school time with accountability, meaning someone's following up on it, the teacher, to actually use that feedback and end up getting, with less feedback, more learning happening. And again, I wish I could go back to my career, because I always felt good when I handed back papers and stuff, and there's all this comments on it, and then to realize in retrospect that a whole bunch of that feedback, it was overwhelming to kids. It was too much. I didn't prioritize it, and most importantly, I didn't assure that in some meaningful way they used it. I assumed they would go, when they wrote the next paper, did the next test, go back and look over that feedback. And of course they're not going to do that, right? They're just focused on whatever the current assessment is. And so that one, I think, if there's any take home from what I say today, among maybe a few other things, is that, provide the feedback, but really work to figure out ways for the kids to use it, to move their learning forward, to close that gap that I was just talking about.
To sort of follow up on that, do you have examples of schools that are either using this approach to feedback, or, what are some schools, I guess, doing well when it comes to assessment practices?
Well, it's hard to pick out individual schools. I mean, I guess I could, but I would commend our viewers to, I think, one of the best systemic initiatives around teaching and learning in all kinds of different ways, and I'm not really involved with them currently, is expeditionary learning, EL schools, and a fellow named Berger, who's their lead academic. They really pay attention to that sort of feedback to kids over time, and having kids keep work and look at it, and also think a lot about, in fact, Berger's, one of his most recent books is Learning That Lasts, or something like that, as close to that. And I'm sure we can put it up to give to the viewers. In the sense that, one of the things about feedback is for what purpose? I mean, why are we giving the feedback? Well, we're giving the feedback for kids to enhance and improve their performance and their understanding. But as importantly, it's understanding over time. That is, it's durable learning. It's enduring learning, and deep learning that lasts, is learned over time. And that's the other reason to have kids use their feedback, because I think we all know the phenomenon where a youngster studies real hard, puts stuff in their head, takes a test, and then 2 weeks later can barely remember what they learned. And that's not enduring learning, and that's not durable learning, and that's not transferable learning. Many educators believe deep in their hearts, I think all of us do, that some important part of what we teach should last and should be used beyond the classroom, not just in the next class, the next in the sequence, but in life, civically and personally, and in college, but even beyond college. And that kind of learning only happens spaced over time. And so that's why not only giving feedback, but giving feedback that's used over time to create that durable learning is really important. And like I said, I think EL has a wonderful website, a rich treasure trove of examples and curriculum, and they're very giving and sharing of their stuff. And so I would commend people to EL education to see how to do that in a very practical way.
Great, thank you so much for that. I guess one other question that really comes to mind is, sort of, as individual teachers, we're in our own space, we're trying to sort of make sense of what we're given, but then there are sort of overarching structures, people that we are accountable, whether it's our school leadership, parents, board members. And so I guess the question for you that I have is more on a structural level, but what can schools and school leaders do to help teachers rethink assessments? What sort of needs to happen on a larger scale to help get teachers to this point where they're re-examining their assessment practices, figuring out what works and what might need to be modified?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Sarah. It's a hard one too. A lot of professional learning, professional development in American schools is not very effective. The New Teacher Project produced a nice study called The Mirage about professional development in U.S. schools. And the title is very evocative. It is a mirage, a lot of what we do for professional development, even though we spend millions of dollars working with teachers on it. And that, I can't remember if I said this, but the mirage is by the New Teachers Project. Linda Darling Hammond at Stanford has done similar research. And, so one thing is in a systemic way, in a school way or a system way, district way, is to really seek out best practice professional learning in all its manifestations. And, things like don't do one-off workshops, don't just do one thing and then move on. Really useful professional learning is spaced again over time. Make it also make sense for the individual teacher on the ground, meaning that whatever we do with professional learning is meaningful to them in their practice. Because sometimes we have these great ideas that at the end of the day on Monday morning doesn't translate to what they can use. And there are other aspects of professional development that are important to do. And the most important one is to carve the time. I've been fortunate working at Columbia Teachers College to visit a lot of schools around the world, but also certainly here in the States. And one of the things that we don't do is carve the time for teachers to improve their practice, to work with each other, to work with their department chairs or whatever it might be within the school day, that it's not added on in a sustained way. I was just in China, in fact, last week, and was visiting some of their top flight schools that are doing amazing things. I mean, all countries have challenges in their education, and like the U.S., we can pick out flagship schools or flagship districts. And I was fortunate to visit those. But what was so clear when I went to those schools and spent time wandering around and peeking in classrooms and talking to teachers is their best schools, and the ones that are killing us in some comparative ways on a lot of the international comparisons, is they are spending tons of time of teachers with teachers and teachers with mentor and master teachers within the school day. I observed that, and teachers in teachers' classrooms. So that's one thing, is how do we rethink time, rethink professional learning. A second thing real quick is also having, again, this is Grant Wiggins and Jay Matai, is backward planning, is having clarity and specificity and priority about what are the most important things that we want kids to learn. And then we plan backward from there. We plan all of our instructional strategies, all of our assessment around the fact that these are the most important things we want kids to learn. And we're going to focus on these. And it doesn't mean we're not going to do other things, but this is our foci, and this is what we're really aiming for. And in fact, what Wiggins, Matai, and others talk about in Understanding by Design, Teach for Understanding and Harvard Project Zero, and other sorts of EL, is they say, figure out where you're going to go, but then figure out how you're going to assess it. And that's a move that we don't always do. We tend to, where we're going to go, we teach it, and then we assess it, almost like assessment's an afterthought. No, figure out where you're going to go, then how are you going to assess it in all the different ways? What's the array of evidence you're going to collect? All the way from traditional quizzes and tests, nothing wrong with those, multiple choice, whatever they are, essay. But also then, for the important stuff, how are you going to have kids use what they learn in performative ways? It's called performance-based assessment, in ways that are challenging and application-oriented, and a little bit more ill-structured and open-ended, because that's where you really reveal deep understanding and durable understanding over time. But that's the second move. Where are you going to go? I mean, what is it you want them to learn, both skills and knowledge and the dispositions? But then, okay, how are we going to assess that formatively, summatively, then figure out how you're going to teach it? So I think those are two things, and those are system level sorts of approaches to assessment.
Great. Thank you so much for that. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to just ask you to close with any final thoughts that you might have, or anything that you really want to leave with our listeners and viewers.
Sure. Well, as I said at the beginning, I teach the learning theory, how people learn, the science of learning. And I'd like to end with that, because that informs a lot of what anything we do in schools is all about. And a couple of quick things. One is, And again, this is no revelation for a reflective practitioner, but what that research shows is great teaching, effective teaching starts what Lee Shulman called inside out. My first move when I sit down to think about how I'm going to design a class or interact with a group of kids as I walk in is inside out, in the sense of, who are these learners in front of me? What do they know? What can they do? What do they care about? And then I design around that my instructional strategies, my learning designs, my assessments. It always starts with the learner. And as probably most importantly is prior knowledge. What do they know? And prior skills. Because if they don't have the prior knowledge that I'm expecting them to have, or the skills that I'm expecting them to have, and I'm going to build on that, then a lot of kids are going to get lost, and a lot of kids are going to get turned off. In addition, another thing, again, this is no revelation for many teachers, is you have to think to learn. Meaning you have to process things. Kids don't learn a lot by listening. They learn by, and not just by hands-on, because you can be hands-on, minds off, but by thinking, by interior dialogues, by talking to other students, by writing. In fact, one cognitive scientist, Dan Willingham at University of Virginia, he says memory is the residue of thought. And that's such a powerful phrase if you really think about it. Memory is the residue of thought. What's left over after I think is what learning is all about. But I have to think in order to create that, literally, those synaptic connections and whatnot. So again, it goes back to, what are students doing with the assessment information that we're giving them, both motivationally, hopefully, but more importantly, cognitively, that somehow we have to get them to think, to learn. And so that's, I guess I'd end with that, is that active learning piece and understanding the learner. Start with the learner. And in fact, my last little quote is from a guy named David Oswald. Someone asked him, all this cognitive science stuff, how would you summarize it? He said, ascertain what the learner knows and what the learner can do and what the learner cares about. Teach accordingly. You'll be okay.
Thank you so much. I think memory is a residue of thought might be my new bumper sticker.
I know, if I had a tattoo, that's what my tattoo would be.
That would be great. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I know your words will really guide our viewers as they jump into the Rethinking Assessment course. Thank you so much.
Thanks, sir. Yeah. Have fun, folks.